Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at some global events that might seem totally separate at first glance, but let me tell you, they're all connected in ways you might not expect.
You got it. We've got reports from Russia, Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza.
And by the end of this deep dive, you'll see how they all fit together. So first up, those drone attacks in Russia. Drones hitting homes, airports shutting down. It feels like a movie. But this is real life. What's the deal with this? What's going on?
It might be a sign that things are changing in the war in Ukraine. Ukraine's showing they can reach deep into Russia, hitting targets hundreds of kilometers from the border.
Like where?
We're talking places like Tambov, remember, where those apartments were hit. People got hurt there. And even big airports like Kazan and Nizhnekamsk had to stop everything for a while.
Okay, so Ukraine's flexing its muscles a bit, but Russia says they shot down a bunch of drones, right?
Right. Yeah. They're claiming they got 85, with 31 of those over the Black Sea. But here's the thing. Ukraine says they sent 74 drones. So even if Russia's numbers are right, some still got through and hit their targets. That makes you wonder how good Russia's air defenses really are.
Right, so it's not just about the damage they did, but about the message it sends.
Yeah.
And what about all that video from the drones? It seems like they're using it for more than just spying.
Oh, absolutely. It's become a propaganda tool now. Both sides are releasing these carefully edited videos showing off their wins and trying to demoralize the other side. It's like a whole new kind of information war playing out on our phones and TVs.
Okay, now for a story that sounds almost too crazy to be true. Zelensky says Ukrainian forces captured 2 North Korean soldiers fighting with the Russians. What? Is this a game changer or what?
If it's true, it's a big deal. It would mean that what everyone suspected about North Korea helping Russia is actually real. And then there are even more questions about how much they're really helping.
So let's get into the details. What evidence is there? What do we actually know about these soldiers?
Well, Zelensky himself announced it publicly. He said they were caught in the Kursk region of Russia during a Ukrainian operation back in August. Right now, they're being held by the Ukrainian Security Service. The SBU Zelensky even said journalists would be able to talk to them.
That's interesting, but if they're North Korean, wouldn't language be a huge problem? How are they even questioning them?
Yeah, that's a major challenge. They reportedly don't speak Ukrainian, Russian, or English. So the SBU is getting help from South Korean intelligence, their version of the CIA, to do the interrogations in Korean.
Whoa, it sounds like something out of a spy movie. You mentioned a possible cover-up earlier. What makes you think that's even possible?
Well, the SBU says one of the soldiers had a fake Russian military ID, like he was trying to hide who he really was. And get this, the SBU says these guys were born in 1999 and 2005, and they've been in the North Korean military since 2016 and 2021.
Wait, hold on. If one was born in 2005 and joined the military in 2021, that means he was only 16.
Exactly. That's what's so worrying about this. It makes you think they might be using child soldiers, which is a big no-no under international law. It's a really disturbing thought.
Okay, this is getting complicated. What happens if we find out for sure that North Korea is involved?
Things could change a lot globally. It could mean that Russia and North Korea are getting closer, making Russia even more isolated. And it also makes you worry about weapons technology, especially because North Korea has nukes. This could reshape the whole global landscape, so it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
All right, let's move on to Sudan, where things might be changing in their civil war. The Sudanese army took back control of Wad Madani, a super important city that had been controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, since December 2023. What's the significance of this?
Taking back Wad Madani, the capital of Gezira province, is a pretty big deal. It could mean the army's starting to win, but this war started over a year ago, and it's been brutal and complicated. There's a lot of deep division, so finding a solution won't be easy.
So even though the army won this one, doesn't mean the war is over?
Nope, not at all. The human cost of this war has been devastating. We're talking over 28,000 people dead. Millions have lost their homes, and there's hunger everywhere. The scars of this war are deep. It's going to be a huge challenge to bring peace back.
And the reports coming out of Sudan, they paint a really grim picture of what civilians are going through.
It's truly awful. There are reports of targeted killings based on ethnicity and horrifying accounts of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. The UN and other human rights groups have seen it firsthand, and now the International Criminal Court is investigating possible war crimes and crimes against humanity.
A harsh reminder that even now, in the 21st century, we still see these horrors of war. And things are even worse because the U.S. accused one side of genocide, right?
Yeah, the U.S. formally accused the RSF of genocide. They put sanctions on their leader, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, and on businesses linked to the RSF. Some of these businesses are even in the UAE. The U.S. says one of them is involved in smuggling gold out of Sudan to fund the RSF.
So even though the army won in Wad Madani, things in Sudan are far from over. What does this mean for the people caught in the middle?
The army's saying they're bringing back dignity, security, and stability to Wad Madani. And yeah, this might be a relief for the people who've been living under the RSF for the past year, but the reality is much tougher. The humanitarian crisis is huge, and fixing it will mean finding a political solution that tackles the root causes of the conflict. It's a big job, and the world needs to do a lot more to help stop the violence and build a lasting peace.
We've gone from war in Ukraine to the terrible situation in Sudan. Clearly, what happens in one part of the world affects other parts. For our last stop on this global tour, let's look at the escalating conflict in Gaza, Trump's envoys working on a ceasefire and trying to get hostages released. But will peace actually happen?
It's tense, that's for sure. You've got violence happening at the same time as these diplomatic efforts. It's going to be tough to get to peace. Steve Witkoff, someone Trump trusts a lot, is the one trying to get the ceasefire and get those hostages back.
So who is this Steve Witkoff? Why is he the guy for this super tough job?
He's a businessman, longtime friend of Trump's physicist. He might not be a typical diplomat, but he's known for making deals and handling tough negotiations. He's been going back and forth, meeting with big names like the Qatari Prime Minister and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, trying to find some common ground and get everyone to agree on a ceasefire.
It's a race against time with Trump about to become president. Are these efforts actually getting anywhere?
There have been some good signs. Egypt and Qatar are both involved, trying to bridge the gap between Israel and Hamas. They're hoping to get an agreement before Trump takes over on January 20th, but there's still a lot to work out.
But even while these talks are happening, the fighting continues. What's happened recently that shows just how urgent this is?
Sadly, there's been more tragedy. Just last Saturday, an Israeli airstrike hit a school in Jabalia in northern Gaza. Families who had already lost their homes were staying there thinking it was safe. The Palestinian Emergency Services said 8 people were killed, including 2 women and 2 children.
That's awful. What did Israel say about this?
The Israeli army said Hamas was using the school and that they tried to avoid civilian casualties, but this has obviously caused international outrage. It just shows the tragic impact this conflict has on innocent people.
So even if they do agree on a ceasefire, will it actually hold?
It's hard to say for sure. Everyone wants a peaceful solution and they know things need to calm down. But the situation is still really volatile, and there's a lot of mistrust between Israel and Hamas. That makes a lasting peace agreement very hard to achieve.
Seems like there's a lot going on here. What are the biggest things making it so hard to find peace?
There are a few sticking points. Hamas wants the blockade of Gaza to end completely. It's destroyed their economy and caused a lot of suffering. They also want Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails to be released. Israel wants guarantees that Hamas will disarm and stop the violence. And then you've got international pressure and regional powers like Egypt and Qatar trying to influence the outcome.
So many moving parts, and the stakes are incredibly high. What could happen in the long run, both in the region and around the world?
This conflict has the potential to really destabilize the whole region. If the war drags on, it could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, make Palestinians even more extreme, and maybe even pull other countries into the conflict, starting a bigger war. And of course, the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict keeps the whole Middle East and even the world on edge. Finding a fair and lasting solution is crucial for everyone's safety and security.
Wow, we've covered a lot today, from drone warfare in Ukraine to the devastation in Sudan and the complex situation in Israel and Palestine. It's clear that what happens in one place affects us all. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we need to talk about the human cost of all this. What are we seeing in terms of people being forced from their homes, suffering, and the need for help?
The humanitarian situations in Sudan and Gaza are both really bad. In Sudan, millions have had to flee their homes because of the fighting. They're living in overcrowded camps or makeshift shelters, often without basic things like food, clean water, and proper sanitation. The healthcare system can't cope, and there's not enough medicine or medical care. And the hunger crisis is terrifying. Some areas are close to famine.
And what about Gaza? How's the conflict affecting the daily lives of Palestinians there?
It's just as bad there. The blockade has made it almost impossible to get essential things like food, water, and medicine into Gaza. The constant fear of violence and the destruction all around them has created a terrifying environment. And the psychological impact on everyone, especially the children, is huge.
It's hard to hear, but these are real people whose lives are being torn apart by these conflicts.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that both Sudan and Gaza desperately need humanitarian aid. Organizations like the UN, the Red Cross, and many others are doing everything they can to help, but it's just too much to handle.
It can feel overwhelming, even for us just learning about it.
Mhm.
So what can our listeners do? Is there anything they can do to help in these incredibly tough situations?
There are a few things. Donating to trusted organizations working in Sudan and Gaza is crucial. Telling others about what's happening there can also put pressure on governments to find peaceful solutions. And supporting efforts to get the warring sides talking and working towards peace is really important for the long term.
All good ideas.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel helpless when we see these complex situations, but every little bit helps. So we'll leave you with that thought as we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the politics and the strategies. But we can't forget about the people on the ground, the ones actually living through these conflicts.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So let's zoom in a bit. Let's look at some of the details from the reports, the stuff that brings those human stories to life. We talked about those drone attacks in Russia, but what about the people who are actually there? What are their stories?
Take the Tambov region. 2 apartment buildings got hit by those Ukrainian drones. 3 people were hurt. And then in Kotovsk, another Russian city, drones broke windows and a couple of people had minor injuries. The physical damage wasn't huge in those cases, but can you imagine what it's like to have your home attacked out of nowhere? That fear, not knowing what's going to happen next, it's going to be really hard to deal with.
Yeah, it's scary just thinking about it. And those 2 North Korean soldiers allegedly captured in Ukraine, it's all very mysterious.
Yeah.
But what do we know about them? Like, how are they doing? What are they facing?
We know one of them had a really bad jaw injury. He couldn't even drink normally, had to use a straw, and the other one had a broken leg. They were both in shock when they were captured, understandably. And then there's the language barrier. They can't communicate with anyone. The SBU is relying on South Korean intelligence to translate everything. It's got to be tough for everyone involved.
It's hard to imagine being so far from home, caught in a war you might not even understand, and not being able to talk to anyone around you.
Yeah.
That's got to be isolating and scary.
And then there's the whole thing about their age and how they ended up in the North Korean military in the first place. One of them might have been just 16 when he was sent to fight in this war. That's messed up. It raises some serious red flags about human rights and kids being exploited.
Absolutely. It's a dark reminder of the true cost of these conflicts and how they hurt the most vulnerable people in society.
Yeah.
So let's move on to Sudan. We talked about the army taking back Wad Madani. But what does that really mean for the people who live there? What has life been like for them?
For the people in Wad Madani, it's been a whole year of living under RSF control. Constant fear, not knowing what's next. Everything disrupted, struggling to get basic things. Now, with the army back in control, maybe things can get back to normal. Maybe they can start rebuilding their lives. But there's also this worry about what will happen to anyone who was seen as helping the RSF while they were in charge.
So there's hope, but it's still a really fragile situation for those people in Wad Madani. And what about all the people who had to flee because of the fighting? Where are they going? What are they dealing with?
Many of them have escaped to neighboring countries like Chad, Egypt, and South Sudan. But those countries are already struggling, and now they have all these extra people to care for. Others are displaced within Sudan, living in packed camps or makeshift shelters. Often they don't have enough food, clean water, or even basic sanitation. They're just trying to survive, stuck in this uncertain limbo.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the suffering this war has caused. You mentioned that the hunger crisis is especially bad. What are you hearing about that?
It's really grim. Some people are so desperate they're eating grass and leaves just to try and survive. That's how bad it is. We need help, fast. The world needs to step up and provide aid to prevent a full-blown humanitarian disaster.
It shows how these problems are all connected. Conflict, poverty, hunger, displacement. It's a vicious cycle that's hard to break.
Exactly. We need a solution that tackles everything, not just the immediate problems, but the root causes. We need to work towards something sustainable, something that promotes peace, justice, and human dignity for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah. Back to Gaza. We talked about those ceasefire negotiations, but what about the Palestinians living there right now? How's the conflict impacting their everyday lives?
That airstrike on the school in Jabalia is a horrible example of the real human cost of this conflict. These families had already lost their homes. They were seeking shelter in the school, thinking it was safe. And then, suddenly, their lives were shattered.
8 people dead, including women and children. It's just senseless.
It really is. It shows how important it is for everyone involved to protect civilians. Schools, hospitals, places where people go for help should never be targets.
It's like a basic rule of war, right?
Yeah.
But we see it broken all the time, all over the world.
That's why it's so important to hold people accountable for these actions and to keep telling these stories, to make sure that the suffering of innocent people isn't forgotten. Their stories need to be heard.
Yeah, you're right. Speaking of those stories, one thing that stuck with me from the reports was the story of this family in Gaza. Their home was destroyed in an airstrike. They lost everything, their belongings, their memories, their sense of safety, everything they had built gone just like that.
I can't even imagine losing everything like that. Your whole life turned upside down in a moment, left with nothing but the clothes on your back and the trauma of what happened. It's life-changing.
And then there's the mental and emotional toll of living with that constant threat, always wondering when the next attack will come. It's a heavy weight to carry, especially for children growing up in that environment.
It creates this constant fear and anxiety, this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that's really hard to overcome. Imagine growing up surrounded by trauma where explosions and gunfire are normal. That's the reality for so many kids in war zones.
It's heartbreaking. And it shows how important it is to provide mental and emotional support to help people deal with the trauma of these conflicts. We need programs to help these kids and families cope with what they've been through and to create safe spaces where they can heal and rebuild their lives.
I agree completely. That's often overlooked when we think about humanitarian aid. We focus on immediate needs like food and shelter. But dealing with the long-term psychological effects of war is crucial if we want a more peaceful future.
You know, even with all the darkness and despair we've been talking about, one thing that really shines through in these reports is the resilience of the human spirit. People in Sudan and Gaza are facing unimaginable hardship and loss, but they keep finding ways to survive, to support each other, to hold on to hope for a better future.
It's amazing. We see stories of courage, compassion, and determination in the face of such adversity. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's always hope.
It's inspiring and humbling at the same time. Their stories show us that even when things seem impossible, the human spirit can endure and even thrive. And it's a call to action for all of us. We can't just ignore the suffering of others. We need to stand with those affected by conflict, fight for their rights, and work towards a world where peace and justice win.
Well said. It's a good reminder that we all have a part to play in making the world a more just and compassionate place. So let's take a minute to think about these stories, about the human experiences at the heart of these conflicts. And when we come back for the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore what these events mean for the future. We've spent a lot of time in this deep dive really digging into the human impact of these global events. But now I want to try to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. You know, these conflicts, they're happening all over the world, but they're telling us something about global power, how it's shifting.
Yeah, it's like we're watching a chess game, right? Each piece makes its own moves, but they all contribute to the bigger picture.
Exactly. So help me connect the dots here. What are these events telling us about the future of global power? What's changing?
Well, think about those drone attacks in Russia. They really show how important unmanned warfare is becoming in modern conflicts. Drones are getting more and more advanced, and more importantly, easier to get. That means not just countries, but also smaller groups can use them.
So you're saying drones are going to be the main weapons in future wars. Like, is this a glimpse of what's to come?
It's definitely possible. Drone technology is moving so fast, and we're only starting to understand what it means for warfare. It brings up all these ethical and legal questions that we as a global community need to figure out, like yesterday.
That's kind of scary to think about. And speaking of shifting alliances and potential threats, what about those North Korean soldiers allegedly captured in Ukraine? What does that tell us about the global power balance?
If it's true, it might mean Russia and North Korea are getting closer. They're both kind of outcasts on the world stage right now. And it makes you worry about things like weapons technology, especially with North Korea's nuclear program. This could make things unstable in a lot of places and change the balance of power in ways we can't predict.
So are we seeing a whole new power block forming, one that challenges the way things are now?
It could be. We're definitely moving away from the single superpower world we had after the Cold War. Things are becoming more multipolar, with new power centers popping up. It creates opportunities, sure, but also a lot of challenges for the international community. How we deal with these changes will shape the future of global politics.
And the conflict in Sudan? It's a harsh reminder of how destructive civil wars can be, not just for the country itself, but for the whole region. It's like throwing a rock in a pond, the ripples spread out everywhere.
Exactly. The war in Sudan has created a huge refugee crisis, destabilized neighboring countries, and made it easier for extremism to grow. It also shows how traditional peacekeeping efforts struggle in conflicts like this, where the roots run deep. Finding lasting solutions takes a much more thoughtful and comprehensive approach.
And then there's Gaza. Even with all the international attention, it seems trapped in this endless cycle of violence. It's pretty discouraging.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the toughest and most complicated conflicts in the world. It's rooted in history, politics, and disputes over land and resources. To fix it, you have to tackle those core issues head-on. And most importantly, build trust between both sides. It's a tall order, but it's the only way to achieve a real and lasting peace.
It's a huge challenge, one that stumped people for generations.
Yeah.
But we can't just give up on it, right?
No way. We have to keep looking for ways to break that cycle of violence and build a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live together peacefully. This isn't just a regional issue, it affects everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways you want our listeners to remember? What are the key lessons here?
First, I want them to see how interconnected everything is. What happens in one place can have huge consequences on the other side of the world. Second, don't just skim the headlines, dig deeper. Try to understand the complexities of these conflicts so you can really grasp what's at stake. And lastly, never forget the human side of things. Behind all the politics and strategies, there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down by conflict. Their stories matter.
Those are some important things to remember. That Gazan family who lost their home, I keep thinking about them, makes you wonder what happens to families like that. Where do they go? How do they even start to rebuild their lives after something so terrible?
Yeah, I think about that too. It's a long and difficult road back for those who have been displaced. They need more than just food and shelter. They need medical care, help to deal with the trauma, and above all, they need hope. The belief that things can get better.
It reminds us that the work doesn't stop when the fighting ends. Rebuilding lives and communities takes time, effort, and compassion.
You're absolutely right. And it needs commitment from the whole world, not just to provide aid, but to fix the problems that cause these conflicts in the first place and create the conditions for real, lasting peace. We all have a part to play in making that happen.
That's a good point to end on. So, as we leave our listeners with all this, to think about what's one final question, something for them to consider as they go about their day.
How can we as individuals and as a global community work together to make sure drone warfare isn't the future? A world where kids don't have to be soldiers, where cities aren't destroyed, and where hope isn't crushed by violence. It's a question that needs our attention, our creativity, and our commitment to making the world a better place for everyone.
That's a powerful question to leave us with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into these complex global events. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.